Afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
From story to story.
From story to story. As you said, we tell stories to make friends. And there have been so many things that have been talked about today that have synchronicity with what I'd like to talk about. From Orpheus and the Wizard of Oz, Voyage and Return stories, creation myth stories and number, and the attractive force for universal harmony, somebody mentioned. For the last 5 years, I have been working on a research project which came out of reading a book called The Cambridge Introduction to Narrative by H. Porter Abbott, in which he said, what makes the story of Cinderella is something we will probably never be able to define with precision. And I thought, really? Why? And I believe we can define what makes the story of Cinderella with precision, and not only what makes the story of Cinderella, but what makes any story identifiable as fitting within a particular story structure. And today, I want to concentrate on one question that has arisen from the work I've done. And what I've done is apply George Spencer Brown's calculus vindications, outlined in Rules of Form, to the analysis of story structure. By story structure, I mean the underlying fabula level of story, which happens in chronological order, not primarily the sujet, the narrative telling of that story, which could happen in many orders. And I plan to talk for about 30 minutes. I may come at the same thing from different angles. And what I'm interested in is how could what I do be useful to you in what you do? And what could I learn from you? What resonates with you? And what seems cognitively dissonant? What doesn't seem to fit right? So here's the question. How do Aristotle's categories, Spencer Brown's calculus vindications, and story connect? My talk's in 4 sections. I'm going to briefly introduce where I sit within narrative studies and methodology I'm using. I'm going to show you an application of how that methodology works in practice. And then what I want to concentrate on, this is the bulk of my talk, I want to concentrate on what I call the mark of bivalence. And earlier on we saw 2 intersecting circles framing a vesicle discus, Pisces, whatever you want to call it. And I think this has a direct relation to this function in story. But I'm interested to hear what you might think. And then a short outline of findings. So by way of introduction, what's happened in terms of applying Spencer Brown's calculus to the analysis of story to date? Not much is the answer. In terms of trivium subjects, logic being the science of the thing as it is known, grammar as it is symbolized, rhetoric as it is communicated, most of the work in terms of the application of the COI has been in logic. Lou Kaufman's done work extending Spencer Brown's work, Francisco Varela, John Lingers, and myself. In the world of narrative, there are only 2 authors I'm aware of, Bruce Clark and Don Kunze, both of which have looked at narrative levels of story rather than story structure. So what is it that I'm doing? I'm taking 6 symbols that are used in Spencer Brown's Laws of Form, and I'm applying them to the analysis of linear story structures. This is the common understanding story. I'm not going to go into the difference between linear and dynamic structures. I talked about that last week, and that talk will be put online in a few weeks. But I'm going to talk about story as a linear structure. So the first sign that I'm going to talk about is the sign of recursion. It comes in chapter 11 of Laws of Form, and Spencer Brown talks about a form re-entering itself, so a snake eating its tail. And I think of this like a baby chewing its toes and discovering its own being through that contact with itself. I use it to stand for story openings and closings, the once upon a time and happily ever after that bring us into the story world and out of it. The mark of indication in Spencer Brown's work I use as a marker for a character, a who, when, where. Without a character, very unlikely you can have a story. The mark of cancellation, which Spencer Brown uses to cancel a mark, it is equivalent to the white paper on which you make a mark, or the void in which a mark is made. And that indicates in my work a qualitative change in the relationship between knower and known in dynamic structures, and the only linear structure it comes into is the koan structure, which leads to enlightenment. That's the only reference I'm going to make to it in this talk. A backwards step in Spencer Brown's work is where big things become smaller with the same value. And in my work, I use it to symbolize an event which hinders a character from resolving the problem they face, and this includes meetings. So when a character is happily going down the road towards solving the problem, and they come into contact with something or someone, and they have to have a conversation, they don't know whether that someone is going to be a friend or helper, or an enemy or hindrance. At that point, they're just stopped in their tracks. That I interpret as a backwards step. It's like meeting a snake in a game of snakes and ladders. But then you have the ladders. In Spencer Brown's work, that's confirmation, expansion. And I use the forward barb to denote a step, symbolize a step, which helps a character resolve a problem they face. It doesn't necessarily mean the final solution, could mean they're on the way to solving it. The sign of bivalence appears in Spencer Brown's work, but is not developed. And in my work, it stands for an Aristotelian categorical cognitive dissonance. And how many are aware of Aristotle's categories? You know what I mean by that? Right, I will give you a handout later. You don't need to know them. But we will talk about them.
But it will be a test later.
You know them automatically. They're embodied within us. But basically, this oscillation is a mercurial quality which sets up a cognitive dissonance, usually in the form of defeated expectation, in the quality of the interaction between two characters. Two more things to bear in mind in terms of what I do. Two steps that come next to each other which have the same quality can be condensed to one and can expand from one. And there can be triplicities. So a backwards, forwards, backwards pattern, which has the backwards steps on the outside, can be condensed to one, and similarly, one backward step can expand to a triplicity. Process of working, I'm going to quickly talk you through 13 steps. Just like Mrs. Beaton said when she was teaching people to cook a chicken, first catch your chicken. First you need to pick a story. Note where you got it from, what's the source version, is it the first version, is it an adapted version? Summarize the story. Note the story opening, that's important. Is there a once upon a time, or does it go straight in? Who's the main character? What's the cast of characters? How do they start? What problems do they have? Are these problems resolved at the end of the story? There's a kind of framing thing. And what happens in the middle? What's the general structure? Then take each character and look at their storyline and the events in their storyline in chronological order. Then look for patterns. Where do they go down the snakes and up the ladders? Where do they encounter unfortunate events and fortunate ones? And is there any... this pattern is pretty standard. In fact, this is very important to the understanding of how a story stories. But are there any outliers? Are there any things that don't fit this pattern? Then apply the symbols. Condense if you can, and then look at the pattern that emerges where you've kept the essential information, got rid of any other thing that is just extraneous. And what I've identified is 18 story structures so far. They look like this. They're all names to you now, but they all have different structures. It doesn't mean there aren't more story structures out there, but these are the ones I found, and they're pretty universal. And then see whether there are any other questions or outliers. So what is this sign of bivalence all about? How does it work? Well, it appears in 7 of the 18 structures, and these are the ones we're going to be looking at today. They look in notational form like this. And I've arranged them in a particular order so they get more and more compressed. I'll come back to this slide, but I want to show you how we're going to apply the methodology, how we get from a story, which is well known. You all know the story of the 3 little pigs. It doesn't matter which version you know. It's important to appreciate the quest structure, which is a pretty standard structure, in order to appreciate how the trickster structure, in which this sign of bivalence appears, better. So let's follow the 3 little pigs storylines. I've gone through the methodology. I've looked at the full story, I've compressed it, I've applied the signs, and the pattern for the quest structure fits. You've got an opening. Once upon a time, the initial situation is that there were 3 pigs that lived together with their mother. We have the who, when, where. The problem is the mother thinks it's time they establish themselves and set out to seek their fortune. The pigs agree with her. They take on her problem and run with it. They go on a journey down the road. On that journey, their journeys are cut short by meetings with people with various materials. Luckily for the pigs, they just hand them over. The friends and helpers in this story are one-dimensional, just very flat. They are there to perform their function. There's no question about it. They are friends or helpers. So the pigs are enabled to build their houses, which they do. They're still in that forward step ethos. The next meeting is a meeting with a hungry wolf. He destroys the straw and twig houses. In some versions, he eats the first 2 pigs. The last pig and his brothers, if they survive, manage to outwit and defeat the wolf. And the outcome is that they survive to live on happily ever after. Seems... Can you feel that backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards thing going on 3 times in the story? That's the quest structure. So what about the wolf storyline? Now, the wolf storyline follows a trickster structure. And in the trickster structure, there are 2 characters whose storylines conflict, their quests conflict. When they interact, one has the intention of tricking or duping the other. In a quest structure, a friend or helper is a friend or helper. In a trickster structure, a friend or helper appears to be a friend or helper, but is actually an enemy or hindrance. When that interaction occurs, you've got a trickster step. Things do not flow forward, they clash. And that clash sets up an expectation which gives rise to a triplicity. And the second trickster step in that pair restores the original status quo. They're still enemies, they're still on conflicting quests, but they've done this kind of double-crossing thing, which makes me think of braiding. Cross, and then you double-cross or recross. So this is the wolf's storyline. Once upon a time there was a wolf who was hungry. That was his problem. He set out on a journey to find food. His meeting was at the door of 3 houses in turn, but the doors stop him from getting to the pig behind the door. So what does he do? He tries to knock on the door and say, let me come in, I'm your friend, really I'm your friend. Pig's not having it, so he blows the house down and is almost about to eat the pig. First 2 pigs, when they run away, he gets to the 3rd one, can't blow the house down. He tricks the house and comes down through the chimney, but he gets tricked, dies a painful death, that's his outcome, and the rest live on happily ever after. Those are the trickster moves, trickster step and transformational twist. I haven't mapped the mother's storyline here, but I will do now. This is how I would analyze a story in full. So the mother, the 3 pigs, and the wolf. The opening is once upon a time. There were the characters I've already mentioned, and the mother's worried. She sends her piglets out into the big wide world. There's a nested quest here. The first pig is homeless. He goes on a journey, meets a friend or helper, builds a house. Second pig, homeless, goes on a journey, meets a friend or helper, builds a house. And, yeah, you guessed it, third pig does the same. Journey, meets a friend or helper, builds a house. And then, the wolf wakes up one morning feeling hungry. That's his problem. He goes on the journey to find food and meets a house barring him from easy access to his food. Not good. So this is where the conflicting quests come in. The wolf wants to eat the pig. The pig doesn't want to be eaten by the wolf. So there's inevitably going to be a trick and a transformational twist. Pig builds a house to keep the wolf out. Wolf doesn't want to be kept out. He asks to be let in. There's a transformational twist. I'm not going to let you in. There's a reset. They're still where they started. He blows the house in, destroying the pig's shelter. Wolf and pig come nose to tail. That's a meeting. Pig escapes, wolf is thwarted. That's a transformational twist. At this point, there's a recap. The first pig has a problem. He's being chased by the wolf. He runs away, that's his journey. He meets his second brother, if he survives, and is holed up in the house with him. Second brother is where the blue forward mark is under number 12. And the wolf has a problem. His pig's escaped. He goes on a journey chasing after it and comes up in front of the door of the second pig's house. He's barred from access, blows the house down, meets the 2 pigs, and they escape. This happens again. We have a recap, unfolding. Very often these things loop in a try again structure. The wolf comes up against the door of the brick house, tries to blow the house down, fails, so he tries the chimney, lands in a fiery pot of boiling water, and the wolf ends up dead or involuntary exile. Sometimes his bottom's burnt and he leaps up through the chimney and runs away and is never heard of. Again, the remaining characters live happily ever after. And that's how it works. But in compressed form, remember we can condense things to the smaller table below. Now, the mother seems to have a transformation structure. And when I looked at it, I thought, no, transformation structures are to do with Ovid's metamorphoses. They typically have an interaction between the gods and men, doesn't feel right. This is a compressed quest structure. And really what's happening is that she has a problem. She goes on a journey, talks to her piglets, tells them what her problem is, probably mentions the wolf. They agree that she's getting older, the house is going to be knocked down when she dies. They have to set out into the world to become independent little piggies, which is why they set off in the first place. That's backstory. There is no divine intervention. So the trickster structure involves conflicting quests, trickster steps, transformational twists, and where the dupe is taken in, the transformational twist results, apologies, I was doing this late at night, in a return to the status quo. It's the Tom and Jerry model. Tom tricks Jerry, Jerry's tricked by Tom, and nothing changes. Rewind, reset, let's do it again. There is a structure I call a trickster variation. Two characters on conflicting quests meet, but there is no intention to trick or dupe. One is unintentionally surprised by the other. In story, in narratives, typically the signals are shipped from one character's storyline to the others. This is what it looks like, and that dynamic that's set up by the meeting, which surprises someone, bemuses them, befuddles them, bewilders them, typically has a nested structure then that unfolds and resolves the cognitive dissonance, and only then can the character continue on the quest they were on. So this is typical of nested stories. You find it in the Arabian Nights. And there are two related stories, the blind Baba Abdullah, Sidi Nu'man, relating to the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. In the story of the blind Baba Abdullah, Harun al-Rashid is out in disguise. He wants to see whether his laws are just, whether justice is found in the caliphate. He happens to come across a blind beggar, gives him alms. The beggar thanks him. Great. And then asks for a beating. Caliph is surprised. This is not usual behaviour that you expect from beggars. And that is another, why that is, and what happens is another story for another day. In the story of Sidi Nu'man, again the Caliph is out in disguise. He finds a man cruelly beating a horse, making it gallop around the town square while crowds watch. This is entertainment. You don't treat a horse like that. Not in an Arab country. And this happens every day. Why? Again, he's bemused, befuddled, bewildered. He wants to find the answer. Therein hangs the tale, which we won't go into today. But this is what I call the trickster or step. So, again, you have two characters meeting, you have a cognitive dissonance, but it's qualitatively different. The dilemma structure is similar, and I thought I'd put in some different examples here. In a dilemma structure, a storyteller presents a story seeker with a dilemma. The story seeker then has to solve that dilemma to bring the story to a satisfactory conclusion. So, let's give you an example.
If your mother and your wife are drowning, I want to know which one you will be saving. If your mother and your wife are drowning, I want to know which one you will be saving.
Typical dilemma story. It's very compressed, but there it is. And you would be then faced with a problem. You would have to go on a journey, look at some arguments that support your point of view, show why the opposing arguments are not valid, present your resolution to the dilemma, and reach a, hopefully, consensus decision. So the story can then unfold and come back. These are typically West African. He was from Trinidad and Tobago. They're used in those cultures to resolve social problems. build consensus, moral consensus in the community, or used as training grounds for rhetoric and legal dispute. And here, the cognitive dissonance plays out in the space between the storyteller and the story seeker. There is no intention to do. Then we come on to Japanese structures, Kisho Tenketsu. These are used in mangas. And what's special about them is they start with a topic which is then expanded. There is no problem. Once the topic is introduced and expanded, a seemingly unrelated topic is introduced. You think, what? Where's this coming from? And in a closed structure, the storyteller then concludes and explains the not immediately apparent connection between the two subjects to bring the thing to a close. In an open-ended structure, he leaves it for the audience to find the connection, or she. The riddle structure, you all know what riddles are and how they work. Riddles are based on substance-based category mistakes. Substance in Aristotle's categories is ousia, the thing he defines as the difference between a living being and a corpse. And that, to me, is interesting. But in a riddle, what is this thing? And finally, the koan. The cognitive dissonance is designed to lead to an enlightened state of being. And interestingly, that appears in the most compressed story structure, going back to the depictions that I've shown. Now, given that the story is embodied, we told stories before they were written down. It seems to be a human thing we do. There are these different story structures. They must have a survival value. What is it? Why do they exist? And what can we learn from understanding more about the way in which stories? And I think the calculus is a wonderful tool for helping us look at this, particularly because there are only 6 symbols. They allow for indefinite expansion, and by using similar symbols for related but slightly different encounters with, as we are doing now, between 2 characters, it allows us to maybe create a hierarchy or look for connections that we didn't appreciate between particular structures. So, given this starting question, I have some questions for you. We have no control over laughter. But what I've worked out is that we laugh when we experience category mistakes that are based on similes. So you're walking down the street, you see somebody trip over a banana skin and land flat on their back. It's a gag, yeah? It's unexpected. You expect to see them in an upright position, that's the one of the categories, being in a position, and they suddenly fall, like that. And they look, why is it based on a simile? A man you expect to be walking is like a man, he's not a man who is lying, he's like a man. I can't explain it clearly.
Dead.
Yes, but he's not dead. And that seems to be the mechanism that makes us laugh. We cry when we experience the correction of a paradoxical category mistake. We experience something that should be, but we have to accept that it isn't. Or something that shouldn't be, but we have to accept that it is. We can't deny it anymore. And when we come to that realization, we cry. Riddles are based on category confusions. But why do we have these mechanisms? And that is an open question.
Are you asking for
Yes, I am.
Oh,
What do riddles do?
confuse you for one thing.
Yeah, but you know the answer to them, right? So if I give you one, what has a bed but never sleeps?
Flower.
Yeah. Although you could argue that flowers close at night. Is there a better answer?
the ocean? The ocean.
Oceans, rivers. But what does that do? I think, don't know, what does have a bed that never sleeps? It's not usual. We usually sleep in a bed. Oh, flower bed, river bed. Leads you to maybe a metaphorical thinking, or
Duality of meaning, or double meaning. Double meaning of the word.
yes, very often they're puns.
Lateral slide, isn't it?
Hmm?
It's a lateral slide. I mean,
Or the plant skin.
that's
another one.
Yeah.
I've never seen it. You haven't seen anybody slip on it, no?
Yeah.
So it would seem that either this is fun and we enjoy doing it, or there is a purpose to it. Show that things that are substance-based are not as fixed as we think they are. They're fluid. If I were to come up with an answer, that would be my answer at the moment. It may change.
Hang on, where's the observer in this? We're making judgments about a riddle, let's say. And we're the observer of the riddle, aren't we?
You can be the poser of the riddle. You can be the person the riddle is posed to. You can be the observer of the process of the riddle exchange.
Yeah.
You can be the person making up a riddle.
Is the riddle in the world outside of my perception of it?
A riddle is based on a cognitive dissonance to do with substance. So I can't think of anything in the world, in the natural world, that fits that definition. Substance is substance. A flower is a flower. The sun is the sun. You don't have anything pretending not to be it, unless you're thinking of camouflage.
I'm just wondering about...
But I would say that's a trickster, not a riddle.
Yeah.
There's a scene in the Buster Keaton film where he's in a film set and he dives into a painting of a lake. That would be it, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a man-made object, it's not a... It's a joke, it makes us laugh, because it's a category... category mistake, not a category.
Okay, if I can rephrase the question. Is the riddle between us and the riddle, or is it between two of us maybe apprehending the same object but understanding each other in the context of that object? So are we actually looking at each other's cognitive processes to some extent? Are we understanding each other through the in the context of the object that you're talking about?
Good question.
Because I wonder, when you asked that question, that's actually what you were inviting us to do. You were presenting us with a riddle, But actually, all of us were thinking, actually, what the fuck's it talking about?
Well, I'm actually taking you through
Yeah,
a dilemma structure.
yeah. But okay, but we're in a position of actually trying to understand each other, really. We're not
Yes.
really interested in the riddle. The riddle is
Correct.
just a kind of vehicle which has been conjured
That's
up.
what's happening here. And actually, if you look at bawdy riddles,
Yeah.
they, I think, are more to do with that. We're trying to see where we fit in relation to the taboos of society.
In relation to each other, I would say.
And, yeah, well,
So
society.
I think this is the intersubjective.
I can feel Peter resisting his best bawdy riddle.
Absolutely. Peter, not
I know you have an influence so far.
So the next question I want to ask is, you know what that trickster or step, where a character comes across something and they go, huh? Wasn't expecting that. That seems to me to be the opposite, the mirror image, if you like, of an wow, aha, eureka, I got it! That instant moment of realization. What do you think?
What are we trying to do in this silence?
I would argue you're following a quest structure.
For what?
To find an answer to the question. Or you're daydreaming, you're going on a creation myth structure, just going forward. Or something else. You tell me, I can't see within your mind.
I was wondering if there's somewhere else to go apart, because there's a kind of a plus or a minus of another way to go, but I didn't find one, but that's what I was doing.
Sorry, say it again. So what do
I was looking to see if there was another way to go. There's like a plus and a minus, and so you think, so the obvious thing would be yes, but I was looking to see if there was another way to go, like another,
Well,
a different, but I didn't find one.
But an aha moment of insight would
Yeah,
be
exactly,
a meeting
yeah.
of a certain kind, a meeting of an idea that, or an epiphany that's come, and usually you use meetings as a negative thing, as a backward arrow, but because it's an insight and you normally say aha, like when it's a positive sort of feeling that you're like, okay, I'm going forward, something's clearer, something seems more resolved. So I feel like, given the way you set it up, and if we're thinking of insight as a meeting of an idea, then I would say a backward arrow. Or if we think of aha as a positive thing, that okay, I figured out a solution to something that is bothering me, that I have there's a cognitive dissonance and I have a positive sort of, it's a move forward in that sense. Or it could be move forward accompanied by a move backward in a sort of,
which would be
double
this
arrow.
compressed
Yes, so
thing.
because that would again open up another can of worms and set you up for another quest because you just figured out one step, that's how I'm thinking about this. But
Which leads to a mapping of the common quality. So you experience that, and then that has to lead to a resolution. Oh, how do I communicate this? And you manage to do the transformational twist and realize you knew it all along. Just you realized it, and then you managed to communicate what you knew but weren't able to communicate to yourself, and now you're communicating to others. And maybe it's that which is providing the insight which has the problem in the first place, and it's saying, it's time you got this! I need to get out into the world. I sit there doing this stuff and I have these crazy ideas and I think, am I going mad? But this is what the calculus does. Now, whether it's an inherent property of the system, or whether there is a parallel in other ways of looking at it, is what I'm trying to work out. And I thought this would be a friendly audience to ask these kinds of questions. Next question. One of the classifications that has come out of the study of story is the classification into threshold and non-threshold structures. And the threshold structures are structures which involve a boundary crossing, typically between two worlds or two dimensions of being, the immanent and the transcendent. The world of gods, the world of humans. This is where fairy godmothers come in, angels, demons, gods. And the only two threshold stories that feature a mercurial bivalence step are the Trickster variation, the aha, and the koan. The Trickster variation seems to have this shift into a transcendent moment. You have to go into yourself, you have to go to a higher level being, try to make sense of stuff, question your own judgment, your own assumptions, and then come back to the dimension of being you were in. The koan obviously leads to enlightenment. Then Nicola, you said, I proposed various topics that I could present on. You said, oh, I want to know about the Voyage and Return stories.
So Star Trek, actually.
Yes, exactly. Typical Voyage and Return. Well, Star Trek, I'm thinking of starting Voyager.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Voyager.
Just as Dorothy was Oz, she's taken to another dimension being
And
via
Deep
the
Space
tornado.
Nine's best. Deep Space Nine is best.
Okay, there you go. So,
I never had you down as Deep Space Nine.
many people who analyse narratives say, oh yeah, Voyage and Return fit into this kind of story. Characters taken out of their normal state of being to a different state, often quite alien, threatening, has to resolve problems there. By resolving the problem there, they manage to also solve the problem they were facing in their original state, come back to their original dimension being done. You see, I don't think Voyage and Return stories are threshold structures. All the translations to different dimensions of being in them happen through, not through meetings of two characters or forces, where there's a threat or a surprise or anything. Storms are natural. Gamma ray bursts are natural within the physical laws of that universe. Tornadoes are natural. They're unexpected. They may be unwanted. But they're neither favourable, they're neither friends or helpers, nor anywhere hindrances. They just are. That's your middle ground, if you like.
But I feel like it's all in that opening that once upon a time, and then you have all of these rules and laws and everything in the story anyway, so it's pretty much consistent. It seems pretty like a simple quest structure almost.
Exactly, yes.
It's not
And what the Voyage and Return does, I found, is that you have a quest structure. The middle pair, going back with pair, then opens up into an extended quest structure.
Right.
That's what differentiates the Voyage and Return stories. In the Arabian Nights stories, magic is counterbalanced by and trumped by wisdom and mercy. So at the end of the story of Sidi Nu'man, the Caliph pronounces a wise solution to the problem that's been going on, and in the story of the beggar, he provides a merciful answer. Both of which counteract the effects of magic. And wherever magic happens in these stories, there is one of these bivalent crossings. Is this a story-based, trivium-based equivalent to the quadrivium-based golden section? Because the golden section can have two positions in a unity. It goes ding, and it provides balance.
That's very nice. Yeah, I like that.
Or is it more akin to the centre of one circle being on the circumference of the other, and vice versa? Is there a
Well, there's a similar situation, as you say. I mean, it can be. I mean, it's a time question, isn't it?
Well, one seems to be. Well, they seem to be qualitatively different.
Well, with
The golden section is irrational. Pi is irrational, I guess. But pi is the relationship between the radius and the circumference, and the radius can be a fixed length. It's just shared.
I mean, I didn't see it like when you were saying it. I didn't see it like that. I just saw just that if you've got the two intersecting circles, then for there to be this
Cognitive
zinging,
dissonance, yeah.
then the time thing is coming in. Whereas, and so maybe that is more what it's about that you're looking at.
Interesting.
Because the golden section is more static somehow.
See, I see it as dynamic. Is it?
Yeah. No,
In terms of its potential position within a unit, it can be left of centre or right of centre, can't it?
well, yes, but that wasn't really what you were looking at. We were looking at it just as if you look at any one golden section, then you're looking at it. I mean, yeah. I mean, if you're saying you're going to switch, then obviously you could. Then there's
Just as you can switch whether you think of the end of one line as the origin or the, what's the opposite of origin? Not destination, the end.
Idea.
The beginning or the end. So,
completion.
yeah.
Leon, you can rewrite phi as a recursive fraction, and it's the most random number you can get.
Interesting.
1 over 1 plus 1 prime
Yeah.
and so on. Maybe that's sort of, in that sense, it's a never-ending adjustment to the...
Nice. So,
You see, that's a random number.
He means in decimal, it would look random. I think.
Like in
1
That
over
was a
1 plus
continued
1 over
fraction
1
version.
plus 1.
right in
You
infinity.
end up with 5.
Yeah.
You can read 5 and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you write out the continued fraction for pi, it's very random.
So just to end, I think the calculus provides a simple yet powerful visual interpretation of story structure. And just go to these and say, look, we're talking about this structure. If you're familiar with this stuff, you can immediately get the shape of the story. You don't need all the words. What else?
That's a bit of a pity.
No, you do need the words. The story
You do
is about
need the words, yes.
History.
But you don't need, you
I'm not
need
going
to
to
know the
get a bedtime
words.
story tonight, just look at these symbols.
Meditate.
You need to know the words, but it gives you an advantage. You can say, I want this shape of the story. Oh, this has happened, right. That implies that this has got to happen. You can just draw it in a few symbols. It's very, you know.
Maybe this is a big question I have for you, and
Oh,
I
good.
think this because I think it came up during the Laws of Form conference as well as a little bit of a confusion, because I know you use the word story and narrative differently, and I just want that's my big question to you, like
Okay, so traditionally within narrative studies, there has been a distinction that the Russian formulas put together of sujet and fabula. Fabula is what I call story structure. Character has a problem, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, step 6. End, from beginning to end, happens chronologically. And story structure privileges time. Narrative, there's a wolf at the door. He's hungry. He's going to knock this door down. The pigs inside do not know what to do. 3 of them huddled up. 2 of them have been traumatized already. The third is frightened he's going to be next, but he's a bit more secure. You see, the other 2 have had terrible experiences. It all started when their mother was too ill. Do you see what I've done?
Yeah.
That is narrative. I've started in media res, in the middle of the action, at the high point, and then I've gone back to the beginning.
I see.
And that privileges space. Story has these 2 layers. And I absolutely, somebody said something incredibly interesting about time is absolutely continuous, space is indefinitely divisible. This is what story does. It behaves in exactly this way. It has those 2 distinctions, and yet they mesh completely.
I'm not so sure that the Tempest storm is not an actor at the same level as the characters.
You see,
Right.
in an oral storytelling tradition, you would explore the Tempest from the point of view of the Tempest. If you're studying a story properly, you look at inanimate objects, and you have to personify them. Then they become characters in a storyline. They can't unless they're made animate. Yeah. What is a day in the life of a Tempest? What are their hopes? What are their fears?
But that's not really a story, is it?
It informs the storyteller's telling of the story.
It's like a Tempest is natural, but a pig isn't.
A Tempest is natural, but a pig isn't. Why isn't a pig natural?
Talking pig.
Talking pig.
Yeah. But a talking Tempest is just personification.
But it roars. What cares these roarers for the name of king?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can a Tempest care? There is an implied personification.
I guess in the
times either in No or Kabuki or in those theatres where that happens. I'm sure.
I think in the Tempest, your storyline is more like your Arabian Nights, isn't it? But the Tempest is an extension of Prospero's will. So I get the Tempest is a character, isn't it? I'm just trying to think it through.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about 3 little pigs with pigs that just open. Is that quite funny?
Yeah. There he goes.
They wear shorts.
Well, they still might go.
There's a long tradition of using talking animals as allegories for things that would not go down well if treated literally. Aesop's fables. The Jakarta Tales, Aesop's Fables, La Fontaine, political allegories.
But what's interesting that there's so much. There's something. Well, first of all, there's something very transgressive about a lot of fairy tales, and there's something very transgressive in the way a lot of parents tell fairy tales to their children. So you can imagine actually just having a play around with the 3 little pigs and doing something stupid, and the kids, of course, find it hilarious.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the relationship aspect of this is very important. I think that's a dynamic thing, which doesn't. It's the relationship to the formal structure that you're talking about. There may be something there, but the relationship between the people who are involved in the narrating, the performing, co-performing, that's to me that's where the heart of
Storytelling.
Yes, I agree, but they are using well-worn pathways, cognitive pathways, that have an inevitability to them.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
I'm thinking of a baby crying because it's hungry, and this all-consuming desire for food and the life-threatening feeling of hunger is to me a transformational story, construction. There's a an imbalance in the natural order. I must scream to find balance.
I mean, you're explaining something, but we need to explain explanation. We need to explain the process of being able to make sense of something which is actually very confusing but we're thrown into. And we all do, academics, that's what most of us do.
Yeah, but there are ways of doing it. I remember when my daughter was a baby and went into the clinic for a regular checkup, and there was a young mother there who was feeding a baby, and she was talking to her like an adult, saying, "Imogen, you are not sucking properly." So, there are story structures that fit and flow for particular situations, and there are story structures that don't.
People talk like that to animals, don't they?
Yeah.
They're pets.
So, I think there are laws of story. There are certain things you can do with symbols, and there are certain things you can't. It just doesn't work.
But where do your laws of story come from in Aristotle?
So, Aristotle talks about categories.
Yes, and he has two types, two ways of reasoning, dialectic and rhetoric, because it was basically concerned with law. I think you are considering the rhetoric, aren't you?
No, I'm talking about the...
You're talking about the absolute logic.
The underlying framework. So a logical argument would follow, probably follow a quest structure.
Yes, yes. So you're using these rules that Aristotle would feed into the dialectic.
Yes, but then how you?
Because I think Aristotle uses rhetoric to dress up legal battles.
Exactly. Yes.
When you're feeling lost, you're going to lose a case. Then you move into rhetoric, like politicians do.
Possibly. I don't think that's not my understanding of Aristotle. Aristotle, for me, was about balancing logos, ethos, and pathos.
Okay, so you're dealing with the dialectic, I think.
Dialectic is the practice of logic.
Yes.
To reach
a
common agreement
yeah.
of what is true within reasonable doubt at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Actually, to add on to the Aristotle view, I feel like in the list of story structures you excluded in the list of story structures you excluded comedy and tragedy, which are the basis of the poetics for Aristotle as well, right?
Tragedy,
and yes, so he starts off the definition of tragedy, and just thinking about forms and how much we've talked about laws of form as this sort of like forms, you know, just thinking about metaphysics of sorts or a kind of a starting point that's really broad in a way, and I'm wondering if there is some if I'm sure you made a decision at some point to be like, okay, like thinking about tragedy or comedy maybe can be too unwieldy as a structure, because maybe I don't know if you used your methodology on a structure like tragedy, and if it fits into any of your 18 story structures.
Yes.
My conclusion is that comedy and tragedy are structurally neutral. They can fit in any structure. So you can tell a comic version of The Three Little Pigs, you can tell a comic version of the story Cinderella, you can tell a comic version of Snow White.
I see. Right. With regards to stories, that would be... okay, that makes sense.
And I think looking at story from this point of view. The calculus is so simple, so transparent, that it enables us to make these connections not only between story structures, but also across different genres. So you were asking about logic, rhetoric, mathematical proofs. I think there's huge insights and potential for this, not only in the fields of narrative studies, educational therapy, but potentially the fields you work in. I don't know. It seems to be, it must be. But my point is that I just want us to get to know the workings of the unknown storyteller, this ineffable force, this energy, this power behind everything. A little bit. Thank you very much.
Great.
Leon?
Yes.
I know of the work of somebody you would love to have had this approach. Mary Douglas, anthropologist, also very religious, and she studied the early books of the Bible, believing that they recorded the stories being told before writing was available. I think it's...
I think I've come across the name, not the work.
Yeah, I think she did Numbers and maybe Leviticus or something like that. And they are written to explore the structures which she detected in the written stuff, which she thinks was inherited from before writing. Might be interesting.
Interesting.
Now, the last time I asked you about stories inherent in things like proofs or reasonings, but then another arena that's related to science and mathematics and natural science is the fact that we have thought experiments, which are stories, and sometimes we just take a certain aspect and turn it into a story. And those are all very interesting. Or a science fiction writer may take a piece of science and turn it into a story. Like Neil Stevenson has Turing and a friend out in the woods camping in the Cryptonomicon, and then Turing starts actually discussing the whole matter of incompleteness and halting, and it's all happening in this conversation, and there's something quite remarkable. It's not you're suddenly not thinking about it in the way you were thinking about it when you were looking at it more formally.
Yeah. So that's what story does. It takes you to a different world where there are different connections.
But that going to a different world is not represented in your model, is it?
It is. It's an origin return thing.
And then sometimes someone, I want to just tell you this one, it's very capsule. Henri Bortoft many years ago wrote a paper about the Young's experiment, and he told the story from the point of view of a protagonist who's thinking only of wholes and parts and perception. And he had two categories of coalescence and compresence, where coalescence is when, like, I'm looking through my glasses and I'm coalesced with them, and compresence are things are next to one another. And he places the observer of the Young's experiment, not quite like a scientific observer, but the eye of the observer, in that place where the slits can no longer be distinguished from one another. And he understands through his story of wholeness that there must be a singular place where the two slits can no longer be distinguished by the observer. And there must be the interference. And this, told without any quantum theory, is a principle of quantum theory that if the paths can't be distinguished, then there will be interference. Nice. So he found a story, a phenomenological story, philosophical story, that almost created quantum mechanics.
Nice. But that goes into the field of,
that this structural analysis of stories may help in understanding how to use story in doing science.
I have a PDF there if you want.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Time to go to a break.
It reminds